My name is Stace Graves. I used to be the kind of woman who could win an argument, with a judge and a coffee stain on her blouse in the same breath. People called me fierce, focused, unfairly young for the wins I collected. I called myself practical. I kept a list in my head of things that mattered. The law degree, the case files. My mother's voice on the other end of the phone. I had a plan, and I was good at following it. Ethan Cole loved me in the way people love what helps them get ahead. He was charming in a way that made you trust a lie because it was so easy to hear. We moved through the city like two parts of a perfect equation. Fiancé, partner, a future with framed photos and a nameplate on a desk in Midtown. He held doors and promised forever. He whispered apologies for small things and made me laugh at consequences I hadn't planned for. I thought of him as mine. Then, one ordinary September night, the equation dissolved. I came home from a client meeting, 3 hours later than I said I would, because the partner I was supposed to impress had cornered me in a glass conference room and offered something easy in exchange for a signature. I didn't sign. I filed the notes in my head. I had to be at the office early, I told myself. I thought of the curtains and of Ethan's ridiculous insistence on buying only whole roasted chickens at midnight. Small things. Normal things. The apartment door was ajar. At first I thought he'd left it unlocked by accident. The foyer smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. Then I saw the papers strewn across the living room like someone had torn the house. Opened to find something inside it. My laptop, gone. My briefcase, gone. My files, the ones stamped with the firm's seal, ripped and scattered. "Ethan?" I called. No answer. The silence was loud enough to echo. My phone lit up. An email with a subject line that made my stomach drop so fast. I almost couldn't breathe. Suspension pending investigation. Internal audit, it read. In the buttoned-up font my firm used for things that destroyed people. That email was a salve. An administration of procedure instead of comfort. I clicked through with trembling hands, scanning the lines that accused me of things I had never done. Wire transfers with my signature. Client accounts cleaned out and funneled into shell corporations. A trail that led everywhere and nowhere in the same breath. It felt unreal. Fraud, embezzlement. The words flicked neon across my life and lit every shadow inside it. The police came before I could call Ethan. They took my statement with the kind of professional detachment you reserve for accidents. My colleagues whispered in the hall. A headline that night, promising young attorney accused in massive client theft, rolled through my phone like a wave that refused to recede. Friends stopped returning calls. The law firm issued a statement. The only person who held the podium with me in that sentence was Ethan. He testified at trial like a man who'd been rehearsing mercy his whole life. On the stand he was soft, recollecting fragments in a voice that made mothers want to nod. "I loved her," he said. He had the jury leaning forward, not because they believed him, because his betrayal wore the clothes of grief. It was a performance so skilled it looked like pain. Evidence doesn't need a human face to hurt. It needs numbers, signatures, bank ledgers. Someone had faked all of it, with a precision that made it look like I was the only person who could have done it. They left fingerprints that weren't mine. They left a signature near perfect, inked from practice and malice. There are ways to make a life disappear on paper. I watched mine evaporate in front of a room that refused to hear my voice. Guilty, 7 years. The gavel slamming is a sound I hear under everything now. It followed me into the van, into the gray halls, into the cell where nights are long and the cold is a constant. Prison is a brutal teacher. It strips you of distraction. It makes you count the details you had never let yourself notice. Before, the way a paperclip can open a lock if you bend it right, the way a human eye follows movement in the dark. You either survive by learning the language of the place, or the place teaches you how to stop. I did both. I read books like they were tools. For every law textbook I'd already memorized, I picked up others, the ones about finance, about ledgers, about shell companies, and the small fractures people leave in their records when they build lies. I read psychology until I could name the exact pattern that let Someone persuade a room they'd been betrayed, and I learned the tedious, quiet crafts people use to protect themselves, encryption basics, how to make a burner account, how to be invisible in ways that matter. They gave me time for good behavior. I learned to fit inside, the gray until it was mine to wear. I listened more than I spoke. I watched more than I moved. I watched how the guards shifted patterns. I watched the technicians in the transfers room sign the same way every Tuesday, leaving a rhythm that could be broken and observed. I watched names the community accepted as innocuous, the ones who came and went from the firm, the ones who knew doors that opened and didn't demand explanations. When I left, 4 years earlier than the sentence said, I walked out like a woman with no possessions but a head full of plans. The parole officer handed me a pamphlet. My mother waited in a car 2 blocks over, eyes wet but steady, like she had been keeping herself too busy to fall apart. She is still the woman who told me to keep my head down and hands moving. She held my hand and said, "Whatever you do, be smart." I smiled and lied. I had already decided I wouldn't be smart. I would be precise. Ethan had built himself a life on whatever ashes he found convenient. He'd moved to a larger office, a seat on a board, a new fiancé with perfect teeth and a portfolio that glittered with things people like to show. I watched from a distance for a long time. I learned his patterns again, the way he left meetings, the names that always seemed to orbit him like satellites, the assistant who scheduled everything and never remembered details. I learned how easy it was for a man to forget a face once it stopped being useful. I didn't go back to the law. I didn't call any of the friends who'd cut me loose. I took jobs that asked for hands but not histories. I paid in cash to rent a cramped room above a bakery. At night, I taught myself things that don't appear on resumes. I practiced with lockpicks, until my fingers remembered the shape of locksmith's patience. I taught myself to read server logs the way other people read minds. I began to understand the soft, quiet mechanisms of power, money, access, narrative. Revenge tastes like metal sometimes, like the clasp of a file drawer that holds the receipts that will undo a person. But it tastes like sugar too, when the plan is sweet and the timing perfect. I made a list. It was clinical at first. Names, roles, events. Then it got messy. It became personal. For everything Ethan had taken, my reputation, the years that were supposed to be mine, the trust, I cataloged a way to take something back. I don't romanticize what revenge is. It's not a poem. It's not a heroic march. It is meticulous erosion. You remove support beams one by one until a structure falls. Sometimes you just make someone realize their floor was never there. My first strike wasn't Ethan. It was a man who'd signed an affidavit, an auditor at the bank who'd washed the funds and told himself he was just following orders. He had a hobby, an open source forum where he bragged about his clean hands. He didn't lock his accounts the way he should have. I slipped into his life like fog. I learned his passwords through a story he told to a bartender, the kind of stupid human detail he thought was private. Money shifted. Evidence appeared. No one screamed. Only the lights in his office went out. It was small. It was beautiful. It told me I could do it. The city is a machine of light and shadow, and I have learned to move through both. I have learned which reputations are brittle, which marriages stand on ash, and which men will fall the moment someone else speaks loudly enough. But every step forward pulled at something in me that I had packed with the past, the part that liked the law because it promised justice, the part that once believed in better things. I keep a photo in my pocket sometimes, not for nostalgia, but for calibration. It is a small yellowed picture of me and my mother in our kitchen when I was 12. She is holding a plate of pie, and we both have flour on our noses. I look at it when everything gets too dark, and I remember why I began. Not because revenge is pretty, not because I want to watch people burn, but because someone took from me the faith that our names meant something. On a rainy night, I stood on a rooftop above the East River and let the water mix with the wind and the city lights. I looked at my hands, calloused in ways I never expected, and whispered a thing I had sworn in a prison, cell and at a council table. And on the edge of falling, they took my life, But they never took my method. They took my name, but they could not take the way I think. "This ends," I said to the rain, "because sometimes you have to talk to the world to make it answer back." I don't know if that's vanity or strategy. Maybe both. But here I am, shaped by loss, steady in purpose, and willing to step so that those who built their lives on my ruin can learn what it means to be dismantled. The first part of my plan is done. The first of many small collapses has happened. They are still unaware that the woman they buried walked out of the dirt cleaner and harder than she ever was. They still don't know how careful I can be. They still think I will do something dramatic. They are wrong. I don't crave spectacle. I crave correction. I want my name cleared and the world to see just how precise a lie can be. I want the quiet satisfaction of watching the truth unfold like a series of dominoes. Small, inevitable, relentless. This is my story. I'm telling it now because sometimes confession is a weapon. And because if someone is going to say the last word, I prefer it to be mine. They say freedom feels like air after rain, sharp, clean, alive. To me, freedom felt like standing in a city that had already buried me once and knowing I had come back as a ghost they couldn't see. I wasn't rushing toward Ethan. No. Revenge isn't about rushing. It's about patience, about peeling away everything a person has until they're left naked in their own lies. If I went straight for him, I'd fail. I knew that. He was too protected, too careful, too arrogant. I had to strike sideways. So I started with his circle. New York has layers most people don't see. During the day, the city is glass and noise. Businessmen barking into phones. Tourists fumbling with subway maps. But when night falls, another city surfaces, the city of favors and debts, of whispered passwords and eyes that never forget a face. That was the city I needed. I took small jobs at first, running errands for people who couldn't afford their secrets to leak, finding out who owed money to whom, delivering information from one desperate hand to another. Every job gave me access to something bigger, a name, a habit, a weakness, and slowly they began to recognize me. Not as Stace Graves' disgraced lawyer, but as someone useful, someone who could find answers, someone who could make problems disappear. I wasn't Stace Graves anymore. I was simply Stace. Ethan's world revolved around a man named Victor Hale, a banker with $1 million smile and the ethics of a shark. He was the one who had signed off on the shell accounts that framed me. I knew it. I'd studied every document in prison until my eyes burned. Victor liked women too young, whiskey too expensive, and cars too fast. And he had a secret, an affair with his client's wife. I learned it in pieces. One careless text, one receipt he forgot to hide, one hotel camera I bribed a guard to misplace. I didn't need to kill Victor. That wasn't the point. I needed to dismantle him. So I packaged every secret, every text, every timestamp into a neat folder and dropped it, anonymously, into the lap of the one man who hated him more than anyone, the husband. By morning, Victor's perfect world cracked wide open. His client screamed betrayal. His firm suspended him. His wife disappeared. His accounts were frozen under investigation. And I watched from across the street as Victor staggered out of his office, pale and shaking, his empire collapsing in hours. It wasn't justice, not yet. But it was a beginning. People talk when they're scared. And when Victor Hale fell, people whispered, "Someone's pulling strings. Someone invisible." That was exactly what I wanted. I became a shadow in Ethan's world, present but unseen. I knew the restaurants he dined in, the hotels he preferred when he didn't want to be recognized, the passwords his assistant used to book flights. I knew the brands of wine he lied about liking, the charities he pretended to support. He lived like a king, and kings don't look at the ground until it caves beneath them. One night I slipped into Ethan's penthouse. It was easier than I expected. Money makes people sloppy. His security was laughable compared to the women I'd met in prison. I didn't take anything. I didn't leave a mess. I just left a single photograph on his nightstand. It was of me from years ago. Before the trial, before prison, before I'd been broken and rebuilt. On the back, I wrote one line. I remember everything. And then I vanished. After that night, Ethan changed. I saw it in the way his smile faltered in public, in the way his new fiancé noticed his distracted silences. He hired more guards. He canceled trips. He looked over his shoulder. Good. Let him feel what it's like to live with fear pressing against his ribs. But fear wasn't enough. He still had power. He still had friends. And until I destroyed them, he would think he could survive me. So I planned my next strike. Bigger, louder, closer. It was 2 a.m. when I stood on the roof across from his office. The city spread out below like a glittering graveyard. I had everything I needed. His schedule, his access codes, his financial records. The truth, wrapped tight and ready to detonate. And as I looked down at the man who had ruined me, laughing over champagne in a glass tower, I whispered to myself, "You took my life, Ethan. Now I'll take yours." Piece by piece. The game had only just begun. They tell you revenge won't heal you. They say the wound stays the same and you only trade one poison for another. I learned that the hard way. Truths never come wrapped in absolutes. They arrive like knives, clean, hot, and with a handle you never expect. When I planned Ethan's undoing, I knew one thing. It had to be complete enough that no comfortable story could stitch itself back together. People will reinvent liars if you leave them a thread to pull. So I pulled everything until the seams showed. My final act wasn't a single blow. It was a symphony of small instruments playing in perfect timing. Someone in my prison cell once told me that revenge is just patience wearing a different coat. He was right. But patience must have choreography. I started with the ledger, the list of payments, shell companies, and roundabout transfers that had turned my life into a fiction. I'd shaped those facts into evidence and fed them to journalists, to regulators, to the person who once called himself Ethan's mentor, and to the very board members who had applauded his rise. They bit, they tore, they called their lawyers. They started to ask questions, but the ledger alone would not break him. Ethan was slippery. He had built layers, friends, favors, a narrative about being the wronged man. So I built my own layer, the witness who could not be ignored. Her name was Maya Alvarez, Ethan's fiancé's assistant, small, overlooked, terrified. She had access to things that mattered, emails flagged with euphemisms, expense reports with missing receipts, messages that were never meant for public eyes. I found Maya the way. I always find people through a kindness that looks like a favor, and a favor that looks like a choice. She wanted safety. I offered her a future. She wanted to be heard. I taught her how to speak and where to point. When she testified, live, in front of a committee that had no patience for polished lies, she didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. She told the truth like a clean incision. And people flinched because honesty is usually softer in fiction than in courtrooms. "You set me up," she said into a microphone. "You told me to book flights and label them vendor relations. You told me to fold receipts and fax them to a manager. You told me to call things something else. I did it because you paid me, because I needed the money, because you promised me it wouldn't matter. You told us we were building something good." The look on Ethan's face then is a picture I keep. For the first time since the trial, his composure cracked. Not the practiced performance of hurt, but a raw human panic. His phone was gone from his hand. He had been carved out on the spot by the person who had once rearranged his world like paper dolls. But the committee was only a gear in the machine. My plan had more moving parts. Regulators froze accounts. A feature-length expose hit the website of a news outlet with national reach. Investors called boardrooms and demanded explanations. Ethan's charities issued statements, and then quietly dissolved after auditors found misallocated funds. The firms that had once courted him began to distance themselves. I watched him fall in stages. It felt clinical, like watching a man be dismantled in slow motion. But in the quiet hours, when the sound of his collapse had faded into a hum, something else rose up inside me, a coldness I hadn't anticipated. It's an odd thing, to realize that when you achieve the thing you obsessed over for years, the satisfaction arrives with a leaden weight. He didn't go down without a fight. He tried to counterattack with a smear campaign, planting stories about me being back to the old Vindictive Stace. He leaked a doctored transcript, the kind that once had ended my life. But by then the world was listening to a different voice, a chorus. I'd assembled by handing names and evidence to people who found power in truth. For every lie he fed, 10 people offered corroborating documents. For every smear, I had a person who had been hurt by the same web he'd woven. The last time I saw Ethan in public, he was escorted from a hearing. Shaken, his expensive suit rumpled. He looked at me. Our eyes met across the room, like two ships colliding in a fog. And for a single, terrible second, he looked small. The man who had taught me how to trust and then use that trust to burn me down had nowhere left to stand. He reached for someone's hand, for a lapel, for a name he could use as an alibi, and found nothing. That was the final humiliation I wanted for him. Not death, not disgrace for the sake of spectacle. I wanted the world to look and see him as I had once been seen. Exposed, ordinary, and finally accountable. But the truth I brought forward pulled others into the light. There were collaborators, legal technicians who had signed without reading, executives who had turned a blind eye for profit, and a man I had never expected. Ethan's father, a philanthropist with a reputation so spotless magazines framed it. He had not only financed funds, but had used his philanthropic trust as a funnel. He had told himself it was charity, or perhaps he'd convinced himself that his name would never be sullied because he was too powerful for small things to touch. When the doors opened to his office, and auditors asked for records he could not produce, he called in favors that no one owed. He called in apologies that sounded like threats. The family name became a cage of cracked glass. The old guard rallied to protect what they could, but you can't glue back together a foundation when every beam is rotten. I had wanted Ethan to fall. I had not wanted an entire dynasty exposed. And yet, as news vans lined up, outside the mansions and as reporters dug into trust documents with a ferocity I'd only once seen in prison when contraband was suspected, I recognized a truth I had smelled earlier. Once you pull at a thread, you pull at the whole tapestry. That night, after the hearings, I walked alone to the river. The city had the smell of wet concrete and something metallic, like a coin slid across a counter. I felt tired in bones I didn't know I had. Maya texted me a single line. "They're talking about you." And me. "We're safe for now." I typed back, "Good. Be careful." The next morning, my attorney called. Papers had been filed. A motion for a retrial, newly discovered evidence. A forensic report that exposed how the original signatures had been forged. The same system that had failed me once was now being used to set it right. It felt surreal. Vindication is a strange companion. It looks like dust on a mantle, expensive and cold. We went to court. I sat in the gallery instead of the defendant's chair. When the judge read the motion, voice even and measured, I felt something inside me unspool, the conviction that had stolen 4 years unspooled like thread. The judge voided my conviction on the grounds of tampered. Evidence and prosecutorial oversight. A phrase that once would have made me dizzy with humiliation now sounded like music. It was more than a legal victory. It was a reclamation. My name would not be the smear it had been printed as for years. Papers would print retractions. Some doors would open again. Some would not. But the relief was not unadulterated joy. Sitting in the sunlight leaking into the courthouse, I recognized that I was not the same woman who had walked in years ago with a briefcase and a clean conscience. I had traded things for this moment. Nights without sleep, friendships left for dead, a calm I'd never feel again. Victory had a cost. There was another cost I hadn't expected. My mother. She had watched from a distance, pride folded into a complicated disappointment that I had become a creature of strategy. When I called her after the verdict, her voice was a tremor and a laugh. "They wrote good things about you today," she said. "You did well, Stace." I drove to her small house in Iowa. She stood at the door like she still did when I was 12, flower on her nose, holding something warm. I nearly collapsed into her arms. We didn't speak for long. We had been saving conversations like rare coins. I said, "I'm sorry for all of it." She said, "You were always mine."